simplify matters if DHB elections were held separately to local authority elections. Candidate information in different languages, again something that was noted, and just a comment in terms of the diversity of our community. Consistency between electoral regulations and local electoral regulations. This might be an easy win. The electoral regulations provide for some of these things that we're talking about in terms of the general election, but the local electoral elections do not contain the same provisions. So it's, the tack there is simply to ask Parliament to include the same provisions in the local electoral regulations.
So just to conclude, I also would like to note that, I mean, we're very aware that we're not going to change voter turnout by working on it every 3 years, and that we do need to work on it on an ongoing basis. So there is a voter participation project as part of the Governance Centre of Excellence, and I've got some dedicated resources that who will be working on it for the next 3 years. And we'll be continuing to do some research in terms of understanding why people don't vote and what we can do to help them to vote. We will be working on advocating for legislative change, not only to the Select Committee, but directly with government, and we'll continue to push for e-voting and for Auckland Council to be part of an e-voting trial.
Great, thank you very much. We have two recommendations in front of us. The first relates to inviting local boards to comment on the submission to the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, and for this report to be presented to them. The second indicates there'll be a further report back including local body comments to finalise that submission. I just want to see if there's an appetite among councillors that there's an agreed third section to that, which would become C. If I read it out to you, it's actually on the screen in front of you, and that's to establish a local elections political reference group of 4 councillors, 4 local board members, 1 independent Maori statutory board member, to consider the submission to the Justice and Electoral Select Committee of Inquiry. I have absolute confidence in our officials that they'll do an excellent report, but the people sitting around this table and around the local boards are the people that are out there participating in this process. And I think for officials to have that reference group would be of assistance to them in the nature of the recommendations being put forward. So if there's any objection, I'll get Councillor Darby to move by way of amendment, but I thought probably there'd be general agreement around that. Is there any disagreement? If not, we'll add that, we'll incorporate that in with the recommendations. I'll move the recommendations, Councillor Darby second them, and now open to questions. Questions first of all, Councillor Simpson.
Thank you. I just wondered if there was any data on the mail for the Monday after elections closed, because you know how you had to post it by the Wednesday to make the Saturday. I just wondered whether the post bags were full on Monday by people who'd potentially posted on the Thursday or the Friday. Did you ever find that out?
We could certainly ask our electoral officer, Dale Ofsosky, if he's got it. Yeah.
When the post was done, mail was always the next day, you know, but with the gap, I think that may have had a big difference too.
Okay, I've got a large list here, as I anticipated. Okay. Councillor Newman.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Your Worship. I mean, I'd be keen to be involved in any such reference group for this purpose. But I mean, having read the report, and I understand you're addressing the timetable for the 2019 local government elections, particularly on Māori wards, which I think is a really pertinent debate. But I just think a gap in terms of the submission as prepared to date. You know, there is a gap there in terms of there could have been opportunities in the 2016 local government election to increase voter participation if, for example, Māori had franchise through a Māori ward option. But that's not something that was necessarily that's been picked up. I know it will be addressed in the future, but is that something that maybe could have been included in this draft submission, notwithstanding the fact that there isn't a resolution from this council on that position, as I understand it.
There's a set process in the legislation. We raised the opportunity within the previous term of the governing body, and we had a discussion about what the provisions were in the legislation in order to do a representation review. If you institute a Māori ward, then that kicks into a representation review. The general feeling was that we weren't quite ready for that, and as well as that, there were two issues which were highlighted, which we made submissions on down to government. One of the issues is that the total number of councillors is set in the Act as 20. So if one of the members was to be elected by a Māori ward, that would leave 19 general wards and a complete rearrangement of boundaries. The other issue was to do with the question of if you have a representation review and population has changed to the extent that ward boundaries change significantly, how do you align local board boundaries, or do you need to?
Okay.
And so the discussion was around those
Too
issues.
hard. All right, thank you.
So can I just follow up on that? I don't think you can change the legislation to say how many ward councillors you have. If there were to be a decision about Māori ward councillor or councillors, my preference would be not to totally disrupt the system just to incorporate that, but to add 2 members to it. Won't make any difference to our committees as a whole, because we currently have IMSB representation there. But the second thing is, so that we could put forward the recommendation in that way, if councillors were of a mind to. I don't know whether you are. The second thing is, as the population changes, there's got to be some way of changing ward boundaries. Otherwise, over time, those boundaries will become less and less relevant in terms of equal representation. That's why we change it at a central government level. So why wouldn't we look at working over time to, you wouldn't want to constantly adjust your ward boundaries, but I think that you need to have provision for over time adjusting them. Say there's going to be another 100,000 people in Drury, we're probably going to want more than one ward councillor in the Franklin ward, although the incumbent suggests that that's not the case. Can you give us an indication of how that discussion went over adjustment to boundaries to take into account population change?
First, just on the legal requirement to do it, the Act requires every council to conduct a review of representation arrangements at least once every 6 years. So we have to do it this time for the 2019 elections. In terms of the statistics, the population figures that we looked at when we last thought about it, the major change is in the Waitemata area. There's been a huge increase, and that would require a rearrangement of boundaries.
Another point I'd like to make is that change in legislation for the number of councillors would be a change to the Auckland Council legislation as opposed to the Local Electoral Act. So it's a different legislative instrument.
Okay. Next question up, Councillor Mike Lee.
Thank you, and thank you for the report. Just coming back to Love Auckland, the publicity campaign, when on page, where are we? On page 107, awareness and likelihood of voting, in section 15, the bullet point, awareness of the elections rose from 83% before the campaign to 93% following the campaign. Are we talking about the election campaign or the Show Your Love campaign, which coincided, didn't they?
We're talking about the Show Your Love campaign.
How would you differentiate whether people became more aware of the election via the Show Your Love campaign or through hearing about the election itself and Phil and Chloe and all the rest of them? Can you differentiate that?
So
that would be hard, would it not?
So in the way we asked questions during the survey, we have, and I'm sorry I don't have the breakdown here, but I'm very happy to send it to you, a breakdown of the different elements of the campaign, and we asked people whether that made them aware of the elections. So we were specific in asking that question.
When, on page 110, section 35, you say a small number of voters in one area did not receive voting documents. Are you talking about the 200 or 300 votes that went missing in Grey Lynn?
That's correct.
Has anything been done to locate what happened to those votes?
We tried desperately, to have to get an answer from New Zealand Post, and we followed it up quite vigorously, and basically we never got an explanation. So the answer is we don't know what happened.
Okay, Councillor Chris Darby.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. In some ways our relevance is at stake here because the numbers don't look good, and you look at the national numbers, central government elections in the 80s, it was 90% turnout, and it's now just under 70, I think 68%, and ours has plummeted parallel in local government. I agree with a lot of the submission points that are being recommended here. I was one of the two minor errors, Warwick, in 2 elections in a row, and it just amazes me that we are still dealing with paper lodgements for a candidate. But my key question here is I look at the elections website and the Electoral Commission's role in central government elections, and then I look at its role in local government elections, and I see a big difference, a massive difference. I see a lot of emphasis and focus on central government elections. That's very important. And so too, though, is other local authority elections. What is the role in local government elections of the Electoral Commission? And can you give us some comparison with the central government elections? Because my perception is that they are bit part players in the local government elections compared to the central government elections.
So the role of the Electoral Commission, the only role of the Electoral Commission in local government election is around enrollment. So they have the role of electors for the whole country, and they maintain it both for local elections and for general elections. And their role stops there. They obviously have a much wider role for the general elections around actually organizing and running the elections, as well as looking after the legislation for the general elections. But it is an area where we've talked a lot about whether we should have, whether either their role should be broadened to include local government elections, or if we should have a local government electoral commission that would play basically the role that they're playing as part of a statutory body. And that's something we could add to our submission. It would certainly be very helpful.
I'd really like to focus on that area because I think I'm a voter, not just in Auckland, I'm a voter elsewhere as a ratepayer non-resident. And I get a booklet from Whangarei District Council, which looks totally different to the booklet that I get from Auckland Council. There's others that live and have interests in other parts of New Zealand. And for me, Mr Mayor, it's a very fractured network of elections that are happening, and it's not cohesive. And I actually think we need to point a lot of this responsibility, not to avoid the responsibility on our part, but to put it back into the Electoral Commission and try and get something a lot more cohesive. At the moment, we're on a pretty sorry road to, heading below that 40, well below that 40%. Well, we are below the 40%.
Yeah, interesting points. Councillors, at this point we're close to 12:30. I just want to test your mood. I think we should probably try and complete this item rather than break it up by lunch, but if you have different ideas, let me know. Can I have an indication of those in favour of extending the session until we complete item number 15 and then break for lunch? if you're in favour of that, can you just raise your hands, please, to give me an indication? I think it's overwhelming. We'll complete this item and we'll have lunch and come back for items 16, 17, 18. Right,
Mr.